Hello, hello, hello. Comrades, you're very, very welcome to Kampala Now Resort Hotel, to this conference. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Sylvia Tamale. I'm one of the editors of Feminist Africa, and I helped to coordinate this event. On behalf of the editors of Feminist Africa, introduce ourselves first. Yeah, before I speak, let's introduce ourselves. I'm sorry. Can we have those microphones so that people might introduce themselves? Yes, I'm Sylvia Tamale. A year ago, I retired from teaching law at Makerere University. But it doesn't feel like I've retired.
Hello, everyone. My name is Charmaine Herrera, and I live in Abuja.
What do you do? Tell us.
Oh, okay. I try and write and do research. I'm one of the editors of Feminist Africa. There are 5 of us. And connected to a number of networks. There's the Nigerian Feminist Forum in Nigeria, but others yes, so anyway.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sharon Omitoshua from the University of Uganda. I head the Women's Research and Documentation Center there, and I teach on the Gender Studies program at the Institute of African Studies.
Good morning. My name is Natasha Luna. I'm a researcher from Mozambique. I like to say that I'm a scholar activist. And I work in a research institution in Mozambique called Observatorio de Rural, which focuses research on rural development.
Hello everyone, good morning. My name is Georgie Chikata. I work at the University of London. But that's me. It's been since January for 30 years at the University of London. I'm one of the editors of Femme.
Good morning, everyone. Nancy Tachibwe, based in Harare, coordinator of South Feminist Futures. Let's talk activists.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Uganda. For those who are not from Uganda, I'm Penelope Sanyu. I work with Forte Uganda. We are co-hosting with Feminist Africa. I'm also an associate editor at Feminist Africa.
Morning. I'm Hope, and I'm a servant of women.
Hi, my name is Rochelle Kokmere. I grew up in Uganda. I'm a writer and activist and the curator of African Feminism. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Kim Akunwa. I'm Nigerian and I live in Abuja, and I lead the Africa program at Witness.
Good morning, everyone. My name is I'm a research fellow with the Center for Gender Studies and Advocacy in University of Ghana. And I'm also a member of the editorial team.
Hello everyone, good morning. My name is Amanda J. I'm from Ghana. I work with the University of Cape Coast, the Center for Gender Research, Advocacy and Documentation. I teach gender-related subjects also with the School for Development Studies, and I'm an associate editor with the Feminist Africa.
Good morning.
I'm Situnya from Botswana. Today I came from Israel, Tamar Golden African Studies Center. That's where I'm currently visiting, but ordinarily I'm at the University of Botswana. I'm also an associate editor.
Good morning. I'm Faustina Obeng Adoma. I'm from Ghana. I'm a researcher at the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, and I'm a member of the Editorials of West Africa.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sheena Magena. I'm not an associate anything to anywhere. I am instead an NGO Lucky at the Association for Progressive Communications. I am almost a failed writer, but not quite. But I am so happy to be here.
Where are you from?
Oh, God. It's always about, I was born in Kenya, but I live in Johannesburg.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ujiba Freddie Watts. I'm a research fellow at the University of Ghana in the History and Politics section, and I'm an associate editor.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Olivia Smith. I'm from Ghana. I'm a lecturer at the University of Ghana and a member of the Feminist Editorials.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Nanyondoke. I am a feminist. I work with Activism Africa as the head of programs. Glad to see you all.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Buki Williams. I now live in Uganda, but I am Nigerian. And I work for Akinawa Africa on the SRHR program. And thank you for letting me sneak in here.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Wanahani Sisingano, but I know my first name is hard, so you can call me Nishi. I'm a Tanzanian. I'm an activist, a Pan-Africanist, and I work in the space of climate change. I'm so excited to be here.
Hi everyone, my name is Priscilla Zimuni. I am Kenyan and live and work out of Nairobi. I work with a collective called the Nawi African Collective, and we work on a Pan-African feminist narrative change shifting on macroeconomic policies and narratives.
Good morning. My name is Leah Ereniu. I am currently straddling two roles. One as a master's student at the London School of Economics. The second, I am conspiring with Crystal to set an African feminist tax initiative related to what she talked about, which is shifting narratives about taxation and just centering the experiences of African women in policy making.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Joy Asasira. I'm a co-director of a nascent feminist organization that is pioneering the use of preemptive and proactive strategies to mitigate attacks from anti-gender, anti-rights groups. So I'm so excited to be here today and looking forward to the conversation. And thank you, Dr. Sylvia, for that invite.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Bill Blessing. I'm a community development specialist. I work with women at the grassroots. I'm a feminist, and I try to identify local women who are actually feminists. And I work with an organization known as Alliances for Africa. We're based in Nigeria, and I'm also a member of the Nigerian Feminist Club. Thank you.
Good morning, sisters. My name is Ihioma Ubibi. I'm wearing two hats. One is the Nigerian Feminist Forum. We have a vice council member of the National Bank. And the other is the ED of Alliance to Africa. Thank you for having us.
Good morning, family. Karibuni. Sabso. I'm Sarah Mukasa. I'm from Uganda, and I work for that imperialist philanthropic organization known as the Open Society. For my sins, I'm sorry about that. But I am a feminist. At least I try every day.
Thank you for trying. My name is Dorothy Tejiapa. I'm also at the University of Cape Coast, the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and also a researcher at the Center for Gender Research, Advocacy and Documentation. And I'm also an associate editor of FA.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm not affiliated with any organization. I'm here for 2 jobs right now. But outside of that, I am a feminist, a digital storyteller, interested in climate change, profile, everything. But I'm happy to be here with all of you and have great discussions.
Hello, everybody. My name is Julian Sita. I am a master's student in digital law and management. Also, just a feminist. And thank you for allowing me to come.
Go back there, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nora Amala, and I'm Ugandan. I'm working with Forte Uganda. Happy to meet you all.
Good morning. My name is Jifata Vika from University of Ghana, Feminist Africa Program Officer, and a member of the coordinating team in charge of financials.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Aki. I'm from Ghana. I'm the Digital Communications Officer for the Feminist Africa. I'm proud of the college.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Abnaya Boa. I'm also from Ghana, and I work for Feminist Africa as Assistant Program Officer, and I'm also part of the coordinating team.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lorisha. I'm a national service personnel currently working with Jufeto Wiki, Feminist Africa. Thank you.
Wow, what a group. What power, how powerful. This room is filled with that power. Thank you so much. Again, you're very, very welcome. Let me read my speech. This is not what I meant, bringing the Minister of Gender.
Those things. On behalf of the editors of Feminist Africa, I wish to convey our warmest welcome to you all. Those who are physically here with us, as well as those hundreds of people, about 500 registered, who have logged on via the internet to participate in this important conference. Like Sarah has said, karibuni, as we say in East Africa. Allow me to begin by introducing our current editors. Professor Georgie Chikata from Ghana. Dr. Shaunae Pereira from Nigeria. Dr. Sandra Manuel is arriving tonight. She had to change her flight because of an emergency from Mozambique. And Dr. Akosua Dakwa from Ghana, who will join us virtually. She couldn't make it. In addition, we have a group of dedicated associate editors. I think you heard from many of them, and staff members in Kampala and Accra who have worked tirelessly to organize this conference. Can you kindly put up your hands for recognition? Asanteni sana. Thank you very much. And finally, a huge thank you to our supporters, Foundation for a Just Society, Ford Foundation, and others who have chipped in financially to make this event possible. Amwa, Forte, and others. Thank you very much. Feminist Africa is an open access online journal launched in 2002 at the African Gender Institute at the University of Cape Town, spearheaded by African feminist luminaries like Amina Mama and Jane Bennett. 6 years ago, the journal moved homes to the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. So for over 20 years, the journal has provided a cutting-edge platform designed for intellectual and activist research, dialogue, and strategy for post-colonial feminism. Feminist Africa is a transformative, anti-imperialist and anti-colonial scholarly journal that works by building skills as it grows through a suite of collaborative training interventions, internships, workshops, and conferences like this one. The journal allows feminist principles and values. Sorry, not allows, follows. The journal follows feminist principles and values. At its heart is the commitment to transformational change through ideals such as inclusivity, equity, accountability, consultation, and empowerment. Our exciting latest issue was released a couple of weeks ago under the theme, African Women Workers in a Changing World. And at the end of my speech, we'll launch it formally. Comrades, your presence in this space tells us that you share our deep, deep concerns about current global trends, particularly how they affect African women in all their diversity. The Charter of Feminist Principles for African Feminists invokes the memory of feminist ancestors and commits to protecting their legacy as trailblazers who made great sacrifices in order for African women to have greater autonomy. Please indulge me and stand up to join me in a moment of silence to honor our departed feminist ancestors. May we have the humility to understand that we are only building on the foundation that they laid down for us, and to have the courage to be transformational in our vision for a new Africa. Thank you very much. Years ago, the African Feminist Forum initiated the African Feminist Ancestors Project, consisting of an amazing database of Black women who engaged in radical political activism decades, even centuries ago. That online database acts as a constant reminder and inspiration of how African women in the past negotiated power, how they challenged patriarchal and colonial notions of womanhood, and how they dissected, critiqued, and reconstructed women's role in society. We know that the spirits of those ancestors have never rested with the sustained gender-based oppression, exploitation, and injustice that continue to plague our continent. But if they were to step into today's world, hardly recognize it, given the radical developments that have and continue to take place globally. Indeed, they would be astounded at their effects on African women. Given all these concerns, this conference focuses on 4 key areas that would surely shock our ancestors. The way patriarchal racial capitalism has reinvented itself with new players and newfangled imperialist scramble for our continent, for our people, for our resources, and for our minds and data. Secondly, the unleashing of the new wave of information technology and the digital economy that has revolutionized all realms of how we exist in this world. Third, the devastating coronavirus pandemic that swallowed over 16 million in 1 year, and its exposure of intensified inequities as well as new opportunities. And finally, the devastating effects of global warming and climate change to women's livelihoods and well-being on the continent. All these developments pose both opportunities and threats to feminist theorizing and activism on the continent. So in the next 4 days, We shall be unpacking these dynamics in order to make sense of the implications of this new world order on our feminist work. How do we critically engage and disrupt the business as usual approaches to our activism in the context of the new normal? How do we link our decolonial quest for gender justice to the wider politics in which hegemonic knowledge is produced? Our main goal will be to identify threats, opportunities, strategies, and approaches that we, African feminists, need to engage with in our bid to facilitate revolutionary social change. To help us set the tone for our discussions is a group of amazing African feminists and thinkers who graciously accepted our invitation to share their wisdom with us. Please join me in showing appreciation and gratitude to our keynote speakers and panelists. Thank you. One day, those of us attending this conference today will occupy the historical space in those archives of African feminist ancestors. May those that come after us also look back with a smile on their faces, recognizing how our thinking, our activism pushed the door of liberation a little wider, how we deepened the cracks, however slightly, of the fractured systems of globalized patriarchal racial capitalism, and be inspired to push on, to crack on. Thank you very much. Now I want to invite Jifa. Can you please come, and Georgie to represent the editors as we'll formally launch this issue, the latest issue of Feminist Africa. The editor who supported this particular issue is not here. Is not here, but we recognize her contribution and everyone who contributed to this issue. So, you know. Yeah.
Thank you, Sylvia. So, this issue, as all issues of Feminist Africa, is a labor of love. And it contains some of the new voices who are creating knowledge in Africa. We are particularly proud of the intergenerational shifts in knowledge production in Africa. Some of these contributors are first-time contributors to Feminist Africa. And the issue focuses on a particularly critical issue, work. I think all of us work. I heard somebody say they were in between jobs. They are still workers. And their contributions are the things that we have to pay attention to. So I declare this issue, Feminist Africa issue, Volume 4, Issue 1, 2023, on African women workers in a changing world, duly launched.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Georgie. Okay, so logistics, before we launch into our keynote, the first keynote, some logistical announcements. So every morning between 7 and 8, there's yoga by the swimming pool. I think it started today. Put up your hand if you were there today. Fantastic. Fantastic. 6:30. 6:30 to 7:30. To 8? Oh, okay. To 7:30. Okay, 6:30 to 7:30. Okay. On Wednesday, we shall end the session early at 4 so that we can go and have some fun by the beach. There is a menu going around with your names. So just select one of those items. We'll begin with dinner, and then we'll play some games, listen to some music, dance, and have fun. In the course of today, we shall also share a departure airport drop-off list for your information. So we have 3 extra seats for the ladies on the mat if they choose to move. Okay, just so that you know. Forex exchange. If you need to change money, please, Penelope is the person to go to. Penelope, put up your hand again. Yes.
No, there's a person.
Okay. We have a first aid desk at the back if you need Panadol, sanitary pad, anything. So you can hear me. Any issues with the room, anything, please contact the Feminist Africa team, Femme. Put up your hands so that they can see you. The people seated at the back there, myself, Penelope, we're here to check any issues that you may have. I know there were mosquitoes last night and suffered with those mosquitoes. And I used the repellent that hearing your keynote on the first part of our, the four themes that we are looking at. Thank you. You should put the mic near.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sylvia. So my presentation is on Africa's natural resources amid old and new imperial relations. What implications for gender justice? It's a huge topic. I have 4 parts to this keynote presentation, so I will try and be brief. The first is historicizing the contemporary geopolitical context where Africa's natural resources are being extracted on such a massive scale. The second has to do with emerging powers and their extractivist engagements. Thirdly, the impacts on communities, responses, and contestations. And fourthly, the implications for gender justice. So for the first 3 parts, I proceed by reviewing key features of work carried out by scholars and activists on these issues before, in the last section, analyzing feminist conceptions of gender justice and specific contextually shaped initiatives to articulate gender justice. So, okay, so what does it mean to talk about extraction of natural resources in Africa? And which resources are we talking about? So, we're having some technical challenges. Maybe that, okay, right. So this is, it may not be very clear at the back, but it's a map of mined resources, okay? So minerals, oil and gas. It does not cover land, those issues. You can see that with all those blobs, all the colors across the different parts of the continent, Africa is rich in different kinds of minerals. And many of these have been historically extracted over a long period of time. What is not in the chart are resources such as timber, land, food, and others. So the next slide gives you a snapshot of some experiences of different women who've been either engaged in extraction or affected by it. So at the top, we had women engaged in artisanal mining. These are all from Nigeria, okay? In one of the Middle Belt states, Nasarawa. On the right, they're involved in, some of the more menial aspects of mining, and again, artisanal level. It's the third slide where you see women having to fend for themselves in the liminal spaces afforded by extraction of oil. A woman baking gari in the heat of a gas flare in the Niger. So the next slide gives you a sense of one of the land-based resources that there are a considerable number of concessions across the continent. This is in a report by the Alliance Against Industrial Plantations in West and Central Africa. And here you have of 2.7 million, roughly, million hectares by 37 different countries. Mainly in West and Central Africa. And this number of hectares is actually reduced over recent years. Why oil palm, you may wonder? Well, We know that oil palm is deeply embedded in the culture and history of most countries in West and Central Africa. And the local production of palm oil was thriving before it was brutally interrupted by colonial occupation, in which much of the region's oil palm forest roads were put at the service of foreign companies, and huge areas of land were violently taken over to make way for the world's first large-scale oil palm plantations. And it was from diverse African palms that colonial rulers, with the same brutal force, established massive oil plantations in Southeast Asia. And the cheap palm oil produced on these plantations with virtual slave labor was eventually shipped back to Africa, turning a region that had once been, that once had no problems producing surplus palm oil into a major importer. And the new wave of industrial oil palm plantations, which is set up over the last 15 years or so, is literally founded on this brutal history. Which takes us to a consideration of what I'm referring to, or what others have, thinkers and others have referred to when we talk about imperialism. So following Samir Amin, imperialism is part and parcel of the development of capitalism itself. And he points out that capitalism has always, since its origins, been a polarizing system by nature. So you have a simultaneous process of dominant centers being constructed at the same time as the peripheries from which resources and accumulation of wealth are, taken, basically. And this process is continually reproduced. It's inherent in the process of accumulation of capital operating on a worldwide scale. And on the right, Tayo Fatula, Nigerian political cartoonist, alludes to some of the consequences of being a country on the periphery. Now, if we place the above in historical context, the first colonial scramble for Africa involved, Europeans competing for territories and natural resources. English, German, French forces were involved in military rivalry. Belgium, Portugal also involved in that colonial scramble. And the forms of colonialism were really quite different across the zones that they subsequently divided for themselves. Slavery had been a long time practice, and initially, fairly early on, colonial powers ruled through concessionary companies. So conquering and ruling by commercial proxy rather than direct or prior to occupant settler colonies. So there was also economic depression in Europe, so there was a need for new markets, and the Berlin Conference between 1884 and 85 established rules for the division of the continent, among these powers. So this had profound economies and impacts, and African economies were thus structured to provide raw materials for Europe's industrialization. With flag independence just before and during the Cold War, that was roughly 1948-62, you had the geopolitical tension between the US and the Soviet Union and their respective allies, and Africa was also affected in different ways by that. Subsequently, the post-9/11 period meant in the US the declaration more or less of a war on terror. And this meant, in practical terms, involved a shift in conceiving of Africa as previously a humanitarian case to now, a place, a zone of conflict in which terrorists would launch their activities. And so there was a need for surveillance. And US national security was linked to both free trade and energy security. In other words, working, and this is in the US National Security Strategy document, to expand the sources and types of global energy supply, particularly from not only from the Western Hemisphere, but Africa included in other spaces, Central Asia and the Caribbean region. Now, Amin refers to US-led, and this, which was formed in the wake of the Second World War. So this is basically the triad that was formed, where the USA and Canada are one part of it. There's Western Central European countries and Japan. But it's the US that leads this triad. And it involves, 5 areas of US monopoly. The technology arises from military expenditure. Access to natural resources is seen as critical for the US, not necessarily for anybody else, where the priority is on ensuring free reign to US corporations to access materials and markets. Finance is also a key domain, with the dollarization of economic relations. Internal communication and the media are also areas of monopoly and control. And finally, the means of mass destruction and the war against terror meant that, military force could be used to counteract US economic weakness and reshape the US relationship to old Europe, the allies, and the emerging economic challenger, that's China. So this has also meant an expansion of US military bases across Africa. Now, I'll get onto that in a bit, but just to give you a sense of what foreign ownership and control of corporations in Africa has meant, this table presents foreign direct investment in Africa by different foreign powers and the countries in which such investment took place. Now, it's 2012 figures, so a lot has happened since then, but the key point I want to make is there are 2 groups differentiated here. So there are the top 3 countries in maroon, and then there are a number of other countries in green. Okay, the top 3 being the US, the UK, and France, and the other 3 being members of the BRICS formation. So that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And the total of the BRICS foreign direct investment, its ownership control of key corporations in Africa, amounts to 9.4 represents the war, remilitarization, strategy in Africa, which is intimately related to establishing monopoly control over Africa's energy resources. Now, these bases, the existence of these bases has been secret for a long time, until very recently. Only in 2020, as a result of a Freedom of Information request, the TERS is the person there, you know, came up with formerly secret maps. AFRICOM tries to keep a low profile, maintaining that it keeps, you know, it's a light footprint on the continent. But what it has are a network of permanent bases, that's on the left. You can't see where they are very clearly, but the idea is to give you a sense of how they are dispersed across the continent. And then the non-enduring, supposedly temporary bases are a number of countries. The list looks long, but let me just point out, 4 of those are in Niger. 5 of them are in Somalia. Then you have 2 each in Cameroon and Libya, and then 1 in Kenya, 1 in Tunisia, and 1 in Mali. Okay? So, now, this is just kind of, you know, say the history to where we are today. And today we have a number of crises, multiple crises. Not only militarization, resource-based conflicts and violence, but the food, fuel, and finance crisis from 2007 to 2008. The climate change has been ongoing for a long time, but the effects are becoming more and more unmissable. COVID-19 very recently, which not only produced deaths, but contracted economies and produced supply chain problems. And here this was, there was the pandemic itself, but also the governmental policies, you know, lockdowns in response to that. And then the war in Ukraine with rising inflation, increasing arms in circulation, and affecting our countries now, and restricted supplies of wheat and fertilizer, for example. So the overall effects of these multiple crises include increasing inequality, precarity, poverty, and insecurity, existential, physical fronts. And so just a few of the questions that one might raise are, what new opportunities for predation of natural resources does this open up? And what are the effects for gender relations amid multiple structures of oppression and exploitation? So we know class, ethnicity, race, sexuality, and more. And depending on the specific context, there may be other dimensions that are not covered here. In terms of new opportunities, let me just say in passing that the European Union countries are now they are actively pursuing North African countries to Algeria, Egypt, and the other one I think is Tunisia or Morocco, for, wait for it, the production of green energy, which these countries will have to use their renewable resources to produce in ways that are not only expensive to produce, expensive to ship, but terribly inefficient. And whilst analyses of the electricity component of this new grab have come across that, what I haven't come across is people asking questions about water. Where's the water coming from? In contexts where there's so little water already. So let's look at emerging powers and their extractivist engagements, the role of China. So this is a map of the One Belt, One Road network in 2019. It has developed since then, okay? And there, I mean, just looking at that, it looks like an imperial vision, does it not? Yeah. And here's a description of what it is. The end state of One Belt, One Road is the building of a community of common destiny for mankind, defined as a new global system of alternative economic, political, and security interdependencies with China at the center. For this reason, Chinese leaders describe One Belt, One Road as a national strategy with economic, political, diplomatic, and military elements, not a mere series of initiatives. So the One Belt, One Road initiative increases China's critical control of critical global supply chains and its ability to redirect the flow of international resources. So, in terms of how this has panned out in Africa, 34 out of 49 countries have signed MOUs or officially expressed support for the Belt and Road Initiative. The East Africa is the central hub, okay? And what the map shows is investments in ports and port areas along the coastline from the Gulf of Aden to the Suez Canal through to the Mediterranean Sea. And Africa's importance to China is, in this regard, stems from its location in a maritime area in which Beijing hopes to expand its presence and power projection. So there are planned ports, railway lines from Mombasa to Nairobi. I'm not sure to what extent that has actually taken place. There's also a route from Addis Ababa to Djibouti, which is China's first overseas military base. And from Djibouti, the maritime Silk Road connects planned and completed port clusters from Sudan across Mauritania, Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria, Guinea, São Tomé and Príncipe, Cameroon, Angola, and Namibia. So you can see sort of all around the continent. And there's also linkages from Kenya, Tanzania further on the southeast side. Egypt, Tunisia are also part of the maritime route, but they're not on the map. Now, China's major, there are 4 sectors in 49 countries. There's a major one going across from Sudan on the east. Industrial projects include mineral projects on oil and renewables and infrastructure, nearly 45% of the projects. So connectivity projects link the industrial and energy project inland areas to infrastructure projects along the coastline. And these take place largely a deficit or a vacuum in strong. So, China presents itself as operating a win-win model of cooperation. Now, it is true that there are benefits to any of the projects that China carries out. Nobody else is prepared to fund infrastructure. The question that I'm left with, which I will return to, is on what terms and to what extent do people in the countries affected get a say? At the moment, the maritime route is used to transport raw materials, so phosphate, copper, cobalt, gold, iron ore, cocoa, an ongoing list, to China and then bring finished goods and China labor to Africa, which is, you know, given cause for considerable protest. Benefits to China: they get direct purchase of key energy and commodity assets from African sources, and infrastructure projects mean that the capacity that they have in steel, iron, cement sectors, you know, now has an outlet. How are local populations affected? Well, the bidding processes are opaque, so people don't get a say. They often involve bribes. Well, that would be the case across our context, not specific here. There's also relocation, resettlement of local people as a result of connectivity, energy, or industrial projects, and very few jobs available. So, it's not surprising that there has been pushback against China's projects, and that's taken different forms. You know, local protests, outbursts in a range of countries, Nigeria, Uganda, Madagascar, Cameroon, Chad. But then there's also different kinds of engagements where state actors, political elites exercise agency in different ways. So, for example, under former President Magufuli in Tanzania, the planned Bagamoyo port was stopped because he just felt that the deal was not to Tanzanians' benefit. Then in Ethiopia, there's been bureaucratic agency, and so actors there pushing back against the wind farms in Adama. And then Kenya's Lamu ports, it was local government actors. There have also been concerns about debt in many countries, Kenya, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Zambia, key ones here, and cancellation dates. So that's happening there. Now, let's move on to look at India. This is another country in the BRICS formation. So there's a combination here of projects on energy resources and on land. And this has taken the form of soft, so economic and infrastructure assistance in exchange for access to the energy resources. In several countries, Indian corporations have access to oil resources. Okay? Now, the land deals in Ethiopia, around 600,000 hectares for agro-industrial projects. They take place through an alliance between African ruling classes and Indian investors. So most states made policies, and it's not specific to India, but it has been highlighted here, that promote the ease of doing business without protecting the rights of local people. And they allowed Indian companies to acquire local subsidiary companies. What that means is they profit from such deals, but they don't have to make much investment in infrastructure or job creation. So it's like an easy route to make money. And public consultations are rarely held out. And in the context of poor monitoring and compliance mechanisms, they basically have a free hand. You know, and in many cases, existing bylaws are just bypassed. I mean, national laws are bypassed. So in the land sector, the projects on sugar in the Omo region or area, where sugar plantations had devastated local communities and livelihoods. The company Karuturi Global got a lease for a total of 100,000 hectares for growing and exporting sugarcane, rice, and palm oil. But the lease was cancelled in 2015 because there was inadequate development of land for growing and exporting sugarcane, rice, and palm oil. And to add insult to injury, the company demanded compensation. So they're in court. Now, contrary, sorry, I keep going to this slide before I'm ready. Contrary to the rhetoric of South-South cooperation, Indian firms behave very much like predatory seeds. You know, they create few jobs, displace farmers and communities, and there are low, where states have been set up, there are very low wages paid to workers and large-scale displacements without adequate livelihood compensation. And the results so far have been mediocre. Many projects fail. So this creates the stunning paradox, this is a quote, of hungry, land-poor smallholders in land-rich countries with the best available land ceded to foresters. Wise in 2015. So, Russia. Now, Russia had been active on the continent during the liberation period, but then subsequently retreated given its own issues in the Soviet Union. But in the early 2000s, there was a renewed Russian interest. And this was to secure their own access to natural resources and energy reserves, given the intensified involvement of the US, China, India, and Brazil. Their objectives have been described as low cost and narrow, so co-opting grain. Peculiar combination of any, but anyway. So you have minerals, diamonds, and oil, negotiated by parastatals. And there are natural resource deals with around 20 African countries. Those countries that are buying Russian arms, Algeria, Angola, Egypt, Morocco, Nigeria, Senegal, Sudan, Zambia. How many of them conflicts? Yeah. So we hear about the Wagner Group. It's the one that gets the most attention, in the context of Russia. But there's no coverage of the mercenary groups on the part of the US. And there are lots of them, not just one. But anyway, the actions of the Wagner Group have been described as Russian support for a beleaguered leader facing a security challenge in a geographically strategic country with mineral or hydrocarbon assets. Now, I would say that that's not very different from US support and interest in African countries. But anyway, we have in the news or certain press reports the involvement of Wagner Group in Sudan from 2017, Central African Republic in the same year, Mozambique more recently, Mali is the most recent. I'm on to my the third section, which is the impact on communities' responses and contestations. Now, on the left, this is the cover of a report on guns, power, and politics in Zimbabwe. This is carried out by WOMIN, the network working on natural resources mining across Africa, with partners, a number of partners. Center for Natural Resource Governance in Zimbabwe, Justicia Ambiental in Mozambique, Network Movement for Justice and Development in Sierra Leone, and they carried out a series, 3-country reports. Zimbabwe is one of them, there's Sierra and Mozambique. And basically what they wanted to find out is what are the intersections among extractivism, militarization, securitization, and violence against women. And the aim of the research was to inform a national network formation and support women's organizing around these issues. So, in this particular report, in Zimbabwe, they look at the impact of Zimbabwe's armed forces on informal miners and affected communities. So the report highlights women's experiences of violence in the context of this broader violence, drawing on existing literature and interviews. The next part of the report looks at the experiences of small-scale and artisanal miners and the difficulties they face, despite their significant numbers, in actually entering artisanal and small-scale mining. So they've often discriminated against using social and cultural beliefs. Additionally, artisanal mining carries risks of violence from security personnel because much of the activity is classified as illegal. So there are risks of sexual violence, and the report concludes by noting that the research opens up an important conversation about the different forms, oppressive forms of violence experienced by women. It does touch on the trauma that women experience and the forms of redress they may want to seek. But part of its aim is to break the silence. Women can define for themselves the forms of support and redress they need. The report on the right is actually titled Breaking the Silence. And this is on violence against women, against around industrial oil palm and rubber plantations in West and Central Africa. So there were a number of groups that took part in this report, and they talk about violence and abuse being a common threat around such plantations, highlighting 5 major contexts: working on the plantations themselves, where subcontractors often demand special favors, and there are other predators, contractors, male superiors, security guards, even their co-workers. Then a second context, collecting food and materials. So if the land that women rely on to produce food is now taken over by the communities, how do they secure a livelihood? So sometimes they try and Apologies to people following online. We had an electricity cut. We're back now. So, as I was saying, in the second context where women experience violence, because their land has been taken over by the plantations, they're left looking for marginal spaces to grow food, or else they need to walk long distances on desolate company roads to reach faraway garden plots or land that they rent in neighboring villages. And of course, that exposes women to sexual violence and abuse, especially from the security violence. Now, and the third context is if women themselves process their own oil palm nuts and use traditional palm oil for cooking. Because the villages are now encircled by industrial oil palm plantations, once the palms start fruiting, that's 45 years after they've been planted, anytime women use such oil or maybe stop on the road, and have their own oil, they face continuous harassment, violence, and abuse. So they're always at risk of being accused of having stolen nuts from the company plantations, or of being searched, beaten, arrested, and sexually abused by company guards and police who accuse them of theft. So the police are there to protect the plantation, not people. A fourth context is when women defend their land in conflict situations with the companies. So there have been a number of those. Now, in one of the communities, women in villages affected by the Sokvin plantations, and I just want to highlight the points they made, they were reported to have identified sexual violence, teenage pregnancy, and early marriage as among the most painful consequences of Sokvin's occupation of their land. And they've been calling on the government to withdraw all armed security personnel so that they can return to their communities, and also are demanding that their land be given back so that they can actually use it for their own agricultural activities. Here is a quote: "We want to see our dignity as women being restored. Our young girls should remain as girls and not mothers. Our right to assembly, movement, and food is all we ask for," said one of the women involved in the struggle. So this is not simply about livelihoods. It's about how to be in the world, certain freedoms, and what it means for young women, the daughters in these communities. Then finally, even though women are involved in support in defending their communities, they're excluded from land use decisions within families and communities. So land is handed over by central governments, and chiefs and community landowner committees make decisions very often. I mean, those are the authority structures, and women are not involved in those. Yeah. Now, having said all that, there is resistance to recent land rushes. So the report I was just talking about had to do with oil palm in Africa, and it's from this community, it's from this report that we saw the earlier map of Africa with the oil palm concessions. You can see that the cover has so many people, even if it's a bit dim, protesting, fighting back against the land grab for palm oil. And there's been a significant decline over the past 5 years, from 4.7 million hectares to little over 2.7 million hectares. And only a small fraction of this area, about 220, just over 220,000 hectares, has been converted to oil palm plantations or planted with new palms. And the authors posit that it's strong resistance by communities that has been key to slowing this expansion. Now, a key text on the right by Samoyo, Pravinja, and Paris Yeros, edited by them. That is it. Anyway, in their own chapter, they look at how this latest wave of land grabs and so on is having very substantial effects, shifting land ownership and property relations profoundly, changing the social character of the use of natural resources, and restructuring the continent's accumulation trajectory. It's additionally deepening the integration of land and natural resources into world markets. In other words, making them available to external markets. And this results in more intense labor exploitation and depletion of natural resources. And that labor exploitation significantly involves women's reproductive labor in dealing with those kinds of conditions. It also, these kinds of land concessions and patterns of land grabbing also have significant implications for the associated control, ownership, and use of water resources, because these are also areas, where water is needs to be accessible in order for the plantations to be fruitful, as it were. At the same point, at the same time, the authors make the argument that despite the emergence of new competitors from the South, key drivers of the scramble are Western monopolies and their state patrons in the course of the systemic crisis. And key countries in the West are the UK, US, Italy, Germany, Portugal, Canada, and Norway, jointly accounting for around 37% of the land being grabbed. It is not the case that the African land grab is led by countries from the East, as reported by Western media and scholarly sources. We should also acknowledge, though, the authors say, that certain semi-peripheral countries like Saudi Arabia, India, and South Africa are also involved in this land grabbing, and they do about 90% of that. China is one of the larger land grabbers, but the scale of its land holdings is far below that of investors from the top three semi. So, in terms of overall impacts, these are, general dimensions. On the economic front, so you have extractivist economies leaving states extroverted, meaning that their priorities are about what they can produce for external markets, promoting forms of development that are basically anti-people, and producing increasing, resulting in increasing precarity and unsafe labor conditions. On the national political front, you have increased malgovernance, governance that's not about making the societies productive for local people or even safe, corruption, conflict, instability, and long-term development being compromised. On the social front, you have vastly increased inequalities, violence across the board, including violence against women, violation of human rights, loss of food sovereignty, the ability to determine the foods that local people value and want to eat, and deepening immiseration. On the ecological front, there's soil depletion, deforestation, flooding, reduced biodiversity, freshwater contamination, climate change, loss of habitat for microorganisms, increased exposure to violence, and increasing conflicts around control of resources. in terms, now what that has also meant is that rural communities are now increasingly marginalized and rural people expelled from the countryside. So, of course, this means in greater urbanization, unplanned settlements and all the issues that arise from that, whilst the core chronic problems, food insecurity, unemployment, poverty, low rural productivity, are not addressed. Now, impacts on women specifically, in a report titled Building Power in Crisis, the impacts of women are highlighted here: loss of livelihoods from land-based work, whether it's farming, fishing, gathering forest products, devaluing women's roles in conservation and protecting biodiversity, loss of ancestral and traditional knowledge of agroecology practices, traditional medicine, restricted ability to participate and make decisions about economic survival in everyday realities, the gender-based violence that we heard about, and increased care burdens, relating to families and communities. And that report is the one on the right, Building Power in Crisis. There's also another report that's useful, to know about, which is the role of regional and international NGOs in supporting land defenders. In recognizing that many of these cases are, maybe isolated, they are at rural levels that don't necessarily have the traction to reach decision-making spaces, and so hence the call for international NGO solidarity and action. And in this process, activists need to recognize that all communities have a right to free, prior, and informed consent, in principle. Yeah? That there is a need to respect the leadership, knowledge, and power that lies in those communities, and that the vitality and survival of the communities lies in their abilities to oppose oppression and foster positive transformation. And communities need to be proactively informed about any project that would affect their land, water, livelihoods, and way of life. And that requires full transparency and accountability from financial institutions and other investors. Local communities need international solidarity to amplify their demands. Now, in the wake of all this horrendous extraction and plunder, one can feel rather overwhelmed, and that there's too much of it happening. But there are interesting initiatives ongoing, which predate some of the more recent crises that we've been faced with. And the set of three that I've referred to, that I've put up here, all involve revisioning the role of the state. So the first one, A History of Resource Plunder, is part of a series titled Reclaiming Africa's Early Post-Independence History, edited by Aishu Balaji, From Post-Colonialisms Today. And that's a research and advocacy project of activist intellectuals on the continent recapturing progressive thought and policies from early post-independence Africa to address contemporary development challenges. And, pointing out that those early post-independent policies had strengths as well as limitations, but they offer a wealth of lessons for today's struggles for control over Africa's resources. And the clarity in that period around the importance of African state control over natural resources offers a path forward for contemporary efforts. It must, and this is a quote, it must be wrestled away from transnational corporations today, just as it was wrestled from colonial forces. Now, the second initiative is, you may already be aware of that, That's the African Feminism's post-COVID-19 recovery statement. So this, by African Feminism 2020, this agenda-setting Pan-African initiative targeting the special envoys mandated by the African Union to mobilize international support to address the pandemic. So in this open letter, they make several recommendations, but at the heart, there is a call for a more proactive and reformed state, which prioritizes policy interventions that reinforces the rights of those most marginalized by current policies and thus more heavily affected by the impacts of COVID-19. These include women and all who experience overlapping axes of structural marginalization, such as economic status, stroke class, disability, HIV status, sexual orientation, and gender identity. The third initiative is a very new initiative under the acronym GETSPA, Gender Equitable and Transformative Social Policy for Post-COVID-19 Africa, with the principal investigator being Georgie Chikata sitting over there. It's a Pan-African program which involves historicizing existing social policy with the view to promoting gender equitable and transformative social policy through research, capacity building, policy engagement, and networking. So 31 countries are involved in 10 country clusters, and this is grounded in the principle that knowledge is necessary, but not sufficient to bring about change. This is what Georgie stated in her introduction to the launch. What is required is an ongoing process of building constituencies, changing mindsets, and achieving a new consensus on the social contract between state and society. So this here is from another conversation between Ekuya Brithum and Amina Mama, titled Unfinished Liberatory Agendas, a conversation with these two. They actually put their names. And she's saying there's a need to get people to be encouraged to frame their own understanding of their conditions, what accounts for this, and that education and political discourse around alternatives is really important. And it needs to begin with activists and intellectuals. Intellectuals meaning not necessarily those in universities, but those who are interested in real change, reflecting on their conditions. And spaces needed to be created in both rural and urban communities where those kinds of discussions that can be held. Finally, I'm onto the implications for gender justice. And I have two relatively short subsections here. One is the conceptions of gender, is on conceptions of gender justice, and secondly, advancing gender justice through struggles for alternatives. So, in terms of conceptions of gender justice, we can locate these more generally in claims for justice. How these are questions that have been raised by different approaches to thinking about justice. They are raised as questions, I'm not giving any answers. But how do you reconcile different aspects of justice? Recognition of groups whose conditions need to be addressed. The procedures, how do we go about doing it? To what extent do these claims address distribution of more equitable, a more equitable distribution of goods, and restoration where harm has been done. And at the same time, other questions are raised, such as what constitute plausible claims for justice? Who is entitled to make those claims? Whose claims deserve consideration? Where does responsibility lie? So these are very fundamental questions. And here, these two covers are one from an occasional paper by Geeta Sen, written in 2005. is a very interesting paper on neolibs, neocons, and gender justice, lessons from global negotiations. And she's and the strategic multiple elements of social economic justice and the fact that these operate in, several sites. And advocacy whilst participating in the UN conferences of the 80s and 90s. So, social development, paper is the contradiction she points to at the international level in the fact that at the level of the UN, the US, you have a very progressive agenda on gender and sexuality, with sexual rights and human rights receiving support from the West at the same time as the global economic policy terrain is completely subordinated to neoliberal economic thinking, dominated by the Washington consensus. So the conditions, the resources to address the conditions for even arising, for even giving rise to sexual and reproductive health and rights are not there. And somehow those proposing this kind of contradictory scenario seem to be blind to that happening. So she's looking at the interplay between these two sets of forces and also examining the implications for gender justice of the shift to a unipolar world order, especially the movement from a neoliberal to a conservative era, which is something else entirely. Now, on the right, there is this book, Gender Justice, Citizenship and Development, edited by Maitri Mukhopadhyay and Navsharan Singh in 2007, so just 2 years later. Gender Justice, Citizenship and Development. So there are a number of interesting chapters in that. In her chapter, Anne-Marie Gertz talks about how the book grew out of dissatisfaction with an emphasis on promoting promoting gender equality through a depoliticized emphasis on changing institutions via gender mainstreaming. You mainstream the institution, and somehow you get gender equality at the end of it. And there was a lack of positive change. So the emphasis on gender justice instead is about highlighting the political dimension of subverting the existing gender order. And there are, in any effort to, promote gender justice, there are unresolved dilemmas around normative understandings and the challenges. So can you set absolute and universal standards for determining what is right or good in human gender relations? How do you offset the rights of the individual against the needs of the family, the community, the nation, territorial state? And what is the state and international community in promoting social welfare and human equality? And Celestine Nyamu Musembi, in her chapter, highlights the multifaceted terrain of gender justice in sub-Saharan Africa. Relations, family relations, or gender justice in economic liberalization. Now, this is one example. Sorry. So one response to having these challenges that Gertz proposes is that ideally the issue of the meaning of gender justice would be established as a practical project through democratic debate. So among communities, what does it mean here? And so this means that power holders in different arenas, domestic, community, private, and I have added in brackets as well, official as well as public arenas, need to answer for their violations. This means including new actors being held to new standards of what is just in human relationships, new methods of scrutiny, and new forums for accountability. So the Feminist Declaration in 2014 is one example of advancing gender justice through struggles for alternatives. And this was in the context of around in the article in an article by Ana Inez Abilenda, where she talks about AWID being heavily involved in trying to shape this new agenda. She states the negotiation process has been complex, frustrating, yet a historical opportunity to reshape global understandings of development in the struggle towards social, economic, ecological, and gender justice. So, and this is part of their statement. They talk about the need for really fundamental change and critique the MDG's agenda. But ultimately, before that, there were several collectivities, different groups coming together to debate that agenda and what would subsequently come after the MDGs. So there was a women's coalition. There was a women's major group, and these were collectives of women's human rights organizations. In the case of the women's major group, environment and development organizations, activists, and academics. And similarly, the Women's Coalition, had women's rights and gender equality advocates across different regions. So they came together in February 2014 at a feminist strategy meeting organized by a number of groups. The Center for Women's Global Leadership, DAWN, IPPF, the Western Hemisphere region, Realizing Sexual and Reproductive Justice Alliance, and Women in Europe for a Common Future. So now they came up with a joint statement, but one of the things that they say in the article is that social movements, and this is a quote, social movements, scholars and activists in many parts of the world are making the connections between the ways in which the global economy functions and the urgent social environmental and political crises facing humanity. Okay, so this has a bearing on what kinds of alternatives are envisaged. So this next initiative, which is the last initiative, is by WOMEN, African Women Unite Against Destructive Resource Extraction, their October 2015 declaration. And this was a meeting in Port Harcourt from the end of September to 28th of September to 2nd October 2015. And they convened the gathering in partnership with groups in the Niger Delta. So Kabekache Women's Development and Resource Center, Home of Mother Earth Foundation, Center for Children's Health Education, Orientation and Protection, and Environmental Rights Action. Okay, so they discussed their various experiences what have been the impacts, how should they strategize for change. And they say that defining justice for African women needs to take on board 4 dimensions of it: energy justice, food justice, climate and ecological justice, and gender justice. So, energy justice very critically means leaving a vast majority of known fossil fuels, 80% in the ground, and developing a rapid global transition from fossil fuels to a reformed renewable energy system. This means respecting land and natural resource rights of communities, guaranteeing work and decent livelihoods, treating energy as collective wealth, guaranteeing clean energy that is affordable, accessible to all, and finally, government-supported research and financial investment in democratically controlled, decentralized, socialized, renewable energy options in which we play a leading role. The we is not actually defined in my reading of the declaration, but what is implicit is that it is women in those affected communities. Food justice has provisions relating to land, small-scale agricultural production, local economies and markets, support for farmers. Climate and ecological justice means, the need for clean living environments that guarantee good health and general well-being, an alternative development paradigm which prioritizes the livelihoods, cultural interests, health and well-being of citizens, particularly poor women, over the profits of corporates. Treaties, international treaties, national laws and policies promoting accountability of corporates, for all their transgressions. And then climate strategies, whether it's debt, reparations, adaptation funds, or mitigation, should benefit the majority of women in Africa: farmers, traders, care workers. So in this context, gender justice means in the midst of all of these other principles, dimensions, women have full equality with men, respect and dignity in all spheres of life. They have voice, are able to participate in decision making, enjoy freedom from all forms of violence, obtain justice when the rights are violated, and all existing declarations, laws, policies, and programs which support our vision of justice for African women should be respected, implemented, and adequately resourced. So I am almost finished. Second last slide. What these various feminist initiatives on gender justice point to are contradictory power dynamics across overlapping axes of structural marginalization that are shaped in specific contexts. And these declarations of gender justice are made from distinct positionings. So from an epistemological positioning, where epistemology has to do with knowledge claims. So the knowledge is grounded in analyses of lived realities in affected communities. And then from an ontological position, ontology has to do with ways of being, articulating alternative ways of being in the world. And finally, my concluding thoughts are that there are a number of different arenas which can sometimes be treated as silos. You have competing interests in Africa as a site for natural resource extraction. On the top left, top right, there's militarization, conflicts, and violence. Bottom left, there's revisioning, the importance of revisioning the role of the state. And on the bottom right, the multidimensional character of gender justice. But in order to arrive at more appropriate, transformative conceptions of gender justice, we need to make feminist connections across these various domains. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening so patiently.
Wow, Charmaine. With such incredible poise, dignity, precision, Charmaine has methodically and analytically lifted the veil on the touch points that have enabled the neoliberal hegemony in Africa and how this new normal affects African women and other African people. He's also discussed the resistance to such hegemony and struggles for alternatives so articulately. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This has been a fantastic introduction to our conference. We'll have a 10-minute break. Feel free to bring in your coffee or tea. And then we'll have the panelists come in and go deeper into some of these issues, raise new ones, and so on. Please, another round of applause for Charmaine. We will have to share that PowerPoint. Yes, we'll have to. Yes, I know all of us want to. Oh, cool. Latest news coming in. President Museveni has signed anti-homosexuality. But even if he hadn't, he had no choice. He had to sign it because even if he hadn't signed it, Parliament would have. Under our constitution, if he doesn't sign, goes back that time, Parliament passes it. So now we are ready. We are ready. We all our affidavits, we've done all the preparations. So we're going to challenge it in court. You're shocked. Okay, can we please go out and freshen up, pick up a cup of coffee, and come back for the panel? Thank you.
Hello everyone. Hello. Yes, so we have chocolates for you. Pass by the table, pick one, and copies of FA issues for you. Thank you.
Hey, Prof. But you say the source. I said you will give the source. Like if Bill? Yes. We need to spend the
I know all of that.
So what did he tell you? Now he just looks at me and he's like, please come back in, please, please, please. Inside, we are ready for the panel. Please come in. Panelists, can you take your seats, please? Christo is already at the lectern. Nancy, where are you? Yes. Have you figured it out? Okay. You don't have to. Whatever, please. Feel comfortable. Just have a seat. No, I'm not. I am, but I'm not sitting here. So Nancy, you don't mind being the second? Okay, welcome back from the break. And to help us delve some more into these very important issues, we have Christo, Nancy, and Leah. They've already introduced themselves. I'm not going to waste time doing that again. But maybe just to remind people, Christo, start by telling us what you do and how you've come to this, and then.
So what I do and
how I came to this space. All right. Okay. My name is Crystal. I live and work out of Nairobi. I identify as a Pan-African feminist. I work with an amazing group of African feminists who work on macro level economics, and I say macro level because macro economy as a construct sort of doesn't take into consideration certain things like the care economy and the things that feminists are pushing and fighting and resisting around. We're 12 associates across different countries on the continent, engaging in sort of this confusing area between feminist work and macroeconomic work and engaging both spaces, which sometimes feels like resistance on Red Bull because one is hard enough and now we've got two, and you're fighting with who I call the governance boys who work on debt, trade, and tax issues. The ones who all wear the same Ankara shirt, they all smell the same, they speak, Amandla, comrades, we know them. So it's a battle between both because African liberation has to be delivered on a Pan-African dream that is centered around feminist praxis as well. So that's who I am. That's what I do. I worked with NAWI for 3 years. I lead NAWI, and before that I worked for Femnet, and I led their advocacy work and work around economic and the international financial architecture. It's a mouthful for the Tax Justice Network Africa, and that's sort of, you can begin to see my background. So I'll start with a quote by Winnie Byanyima, and she says, "It is women crushed at the bottom of a global economic heap whose poverty powers the supposed success of globalization." And I'm going to hope to be as eloquent and poised as Charmaine. I speak fast, especially when I'm speaking about these things. So I'm going to try and speak slow and be centered. I was really taking notes. So the dominant approaches to macro level economic policies over the last 4 decades, and prevalent especially in Africa since the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank structural adjustment programs of the 80s emphasized on the supply side of the economy. And we all remember the 80s and early 90s when structural adjustment programs happened in all our countries. We liberalized, privatized a lot of public services, and suddenly we had to pay for all these things, and we're all scrambling to make sure that we had jobs to pay for private healthcare, private education. But there was also an elevation in terms of value. What was seen as better was always private. And that change in narrative is something that permeated our economies, our societies, our thinking, and has changed the narrative even of us and of the continent with a growing population that is predominantly under 35. And so this resulted in an emphasis on macroeconomic policy, creating a conducive environment. They use words like conducive and effective and efficient for market mechanisms to expand production, and more importantly, for all these spaces, grow the economy. Economic growth has been central to these economic conversations. Likewise focused on creating a conducive environment for market activity, and particularly for financial markets, with a focus on low inflation at the cost of employment and just development objectives in general. And this really results in a state regulation that benefits private accumulation of wealth through market mechanisms and a highly extractive profit maximization. And a lot of the time, the profit maximization and market mechanisms largely foreign owned, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So as I said, the focus on economic growth with a focus on markets has over the years really resulted in a disinvestment in public goods, a privatization of social services, and the deregulation of labor and financial markets, and alongside the stagnation of actual real wages for people. So people are really struggling more and more to survive. But at the same time as most Africans and African women are struggling, white capital is accumulating as a result and has been growing, and over COVID has grown exponentially. The financialization of everyday life means that people have to borrow in order to consume, and the public provision of health, education, water, and housing has been replaced by private provisioning of these public goods. The cost of borrowing to meet these obligations has deepened, and the link between social reproduction and household debt, drawing households into a financial system and trapping them into generational cycles of poverty. And we know this story really well. Extraction at the service of white capital in a number of ways, and tax is one of them. So you've heard a lot about the concept of illicit financial flows, where Africa as a continent alone has been estimated to lose $86 billion every year. In almost half a century, between 1970 and 2015, Africa lost approximately 1.4 trillion in capital flight, and that's in dollars. This is far more than the total stock of debt owed us as of 2015, this is far more than the total stock of debt owed as of 2015, which is $496.9 billion, and the cumulative amount of foreign aid received in the same period was $991.8 billion. So simple math, we should be able to pay for our own development. Revenue losses through corporate tax avoidance in Africa. The amount the continent loses in form of illicit financial flows is equal to between 1 and 2/3 of its total official development assistance. And as such, Africa can be said to be a net creditor to the world. But this narrative is never really in the public domain. It also turns on its head a narrative about us over and over. That is, we're perpetually in this space because of our corruption, we have corrupt leaders, and that is usually what is centered around why we're where we are. But if you look at that $86 billion that we lose every year, only 5% of that is through corruption. And this begins to then tell a different story and narrative. And so narratives and the words we tell ourselves are important. Over 60% of this $86 billion is lost through commercial activity. And mostly it's through foreign multinationals finding loopholes to not pay their fair share of taxes in the countries that they operate and extract from. And I think Charmaine's presentation in the morning began to show us, a sneak peek into some of the multinationals in our region. A lot of this 60% of the 86 billion is through not just commercial activity, but through the extractive industry. And so this is our biggest source of leaking. But we can also look at debt. Not a day goes by, especially now, without us hearing a story of debt. This month, Ghana signed a new program with IMF. This is the 18th program that they have signed, with the 17 programs before being sold as a silver bullet that would unleash Ghana's economic might. Similarly, Zambia has signed 14, and we know where Zambia is, knocking on the doors of the IMF as well, continuously. My own country, Kenya, is also knocking on IMF doors, and this year, for the first time in at least my living memory, was unable to pay civil servants and chose instead to service their foreign debt, and that has very many questions around it. We know the story well. It is one of austerity. It is one of drastic cuts in public spending to consolidate the fiscus, and this is what we're told. We know that services that are needed mostly by women are the first on the chopping block. In its place are private solutions to very public problems and locking services behind user fees that many women are unable to afford. And not only unable to afford, but the externalization of these services to women continues to happen. The stripping away of public services doesn't mean that these functions disappear in tandem. It's just that women continue to subsidize the state, taking care of the elderly, of children, of the sick, making sure people are fed, people are loved, people are taken care of. Without this work being seen, this work being invisibilized, with this work being completely invisibilized in how we calculate our economies and what upholds our communities, our societies, our economies. And so from the IMF and the World Bank, the general formula for this spiral is as follows. 1, countries go into short-term balance of payments of debt because of their lack of capital, much of it stolen during the colonial period, and their reliance upon borrowing to conduct often expensive capital improvements in their countries, some of which are in the raw material extraction sector, and thereby operating as a subsidy for foreign mining activities and companies. And we saw the map, the China One Belt project, all of the extraction and development that is centered around infrastructure to extract. Secondly, the IMF then arrives and informs the finance ministers that the government spending for education, healthcare, and other social development projects must be cut in order to prioritize payments. And these payments are usually to wealthy bondholders in the London Club and to governments, mostly in old colonial states, who have lent the money for things and projects that we're not too sure whose priorities they serve. And third, to pay the debt servicing on these loans, poor nations cut their government spending and then impoverishing their people further and exporting more of their cheap and raw materials rather than the more profitable finished products, because we're so desperate at this point. And when countries start to export more and more primary commodities, this produces a price war that leads to a steep decline in the revenues gained from the volume of exports. Fourth, with weakened revenues from imports, poor nations must continue to cut social spending, ramp up their sales of raw materials and public assets, and borrow more money from external private and government resources just to pay off the interest on their ballooning debt. Fifth, the imperative of exchange rate stability prevents governments in the poor nations from exercising any effective monetary policy, including implementing capital controls, while their fiscal policy is already eviscerated by balanced budget demands from the IMF, social spending cuts, and pressure from wealthy bondholders to reform, and really keywords for surrender, their tax policy, and there goes your taxing rights as a country. And as part of this cycle, the World Bank then comes in because you're cutting spending, public spending on public services, healthcare, maternal healthcare, education, public transport, housing, water. The World Bank then swoops in with what they call the cascade approach. And the cascade approach is very simple. It's basically the World Bank comes in and says, well, you seem to have a problem with healthcare, and we have a private solution for you. We know who the private financing entity is that can help you deliver healthcare for your people, and we can help on the back end to come up with the contracts that you'll sign and the agreements that you'll sign for them to come in. But as we know, Africa is very risky. And who determines this risk is, three private companies in the US who determine what our credit rating systems are. And so because you're so risky, you have to change your policies and legislations to allow for private investment to come in. And that's done. And once that's done, they're like, okay, good job. But now, because you're still so risky, you have to de-risk private investment, because private investment bottom line will always be profit. So you need to have clauses that make sure that their investment in your countries and in your projects are completely de-risked, which means de-risking against natural hazards, de-risking against loss of profit, and that will usually come from taxpayers' money. And so the cycle goes on between the IMF and the World Bank, and we're sort of caught in the middle without any say on our own sovereignty in terms of economic decision-making, how we run our economy, but also moving away from economic growth as a center of our planning and moving towards a point where citizens and actual people's needs and priorities are centered is something. And as we talk about this external influence and who decides what we get invested in versus what we don't get invested in, and Charmaine spoke about mega infrastructure and the road systems, that's usually what takes precedence of investment. And so if maternal health care doesn't seem profitable, it's off the table, and instead it'll be the SGR rail in Kenya or the expressway in Kenya. The SGR, I think, was 7% of Kenya's 7% of Kenya's GDP in our payment annually of that debt, yet less than 1% will use things like the expressway that we have, that we've so dearly spent money on, and money that could be used in other things, mass transport system, housing programs, healthcare programs. We're not lacking in a list of things that we could invest in. And so on debt, Sankara spoke about debt being a cleverly managed reconquest of Africa aimed at subjugating its growth and development through foreign rules. Agazeta Bate, one of our Nawi associates, talks about how every time we're in these rooms of power, you're at the end of a barrel of a gun, begging for your life. Every time you come out wounded. And she's looking at me. We all feel this when we're in spaces around, the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. We're in the World Bank meetings, at the IMF, at trade negotiations. We know that the system is geared against us. We know that the system was designed to extract and to extract violently. We know that the system was designed to only flourish for a select few 1%. And has to be subsidized by people. And I think I will speak a little bit about the subsidy of labor, correct? Of women's labor. And the theme of extraction has gone on through time. The current economic model tends to look at the system as apolitical, ahistorical, and really technical. But we know that the economy and the global economic architecture is one that's deeply political and deeply historical. It's a story of extraction from this continent where slavery, contributed $97 trillion of an investment of free slave labor of 222 million hours. And that calculation doesn't even have a calculation of women's labor in the slave movement, in the slave trade. So that started with a slavery story and narrative. We then go into a colonial period and era, and we know that story well. We go into the structural adjustment programs of the 80s and 90s. And as we go through what some people call the triple C, COVID, climate, and conflict. It's also a question of power at the heart of that analysis of the triple C. When we speak about conflict and everybody centering conversations about Ukraine, my own country imports 78% of our wheat from Ukraine and Russia. And if we go back to reclaiming ourselves, like Charmaine said, Africa was 93% food sovereign in the 70s and early 80s. There's a question there on how we retrogress so far. It's a story of, making sure that we're reclaiming ourselves, reclaiming our economic policies. The Post-Colonialisms Today project that I'm part of, that Charmaine talked about, is going back to those policies when we had more developmentalist states on the continent. We had Thomas Sankara, we had Nyerere, but even reclaim that, making sure that the new Pan-African story is feminist, and like Sylvia's book talks about. And that's part of why these silos need to be broken down. Sarah is always talking about how, the feminist movement has to have these conversations, engagements, and entanglements really with economic order questions, and an economic order that is racist, that is sexist, that is patriarchal, that is classed, but that's also violently extractive. So there's a growing body of work and a growing movement that is calling for reparations as we go forward. And reparations not just in a repayment of monetary value, but for all the harm caused, for all the harm caused, and by an overhauling of an entire system that will continue to violently extract, even if we were to be paid back an amount. And this call for reparation sits on 5 components. The first is restitution and reparation. The second is satisfaction. The third is compensation. The fourth is rehabilitation. And finally, okay. The first is restitution and reparation. The second is satisfaction. The third is compensation. The fourth is rehabilitation. And finally, cessation and guarantee of non-repetition. The movement also puts forth the idea that those who caused and continue to cause the harm are not those who determine the remedy. During the COVID pandemic, the height of the pandemic, Arundhati Roy talked about COVID being a portal, a gateway between one world and the next, a moment in time and history where we have a chance to determine which way to go. But this window is slowly closing. And it has become imperative that we no longer have the time to wait for the analysis of what is wrong to be told by foreigners. We know that the current economic order operates without an acknowledgement of history, as if the economy is just a technical construct, when we know it is deeply political. It has never been as important as it is now to change the story of us, of our people and our continent, to do the debt analysis, to do the trade analysis, to do the tax analysis, in our own voices based on our own histories, our contemporary nuances, and our existence, and then push for alternatives based on that. And there's a few pockets of alternatives that are coming up from the feminist movement. Nancy's part of movements in different spaces that do that from an economic and political economy perspective. All the while centering the question around how we build towards a transformative global economic architecture that is in service of life, that is not in service of economic growth, but in service of life. And part of this political work for us in Nawi is dreaming. And feminists know the work of reimagining futures all too well. And so I end with a section from a visioning piece by Nawi called In a Time Not So Far Away, and I can share the link later. And it says, in a time not so far away, a time perhaps parallel to the one we are in now, a new way is coming into being. The next time you blink, stay there. Keep your eyes closed for just a few more seconds and you will see it. Future coming into being, the future now. In this place, care is a story also told in numbers. When the people create budgets, they ask questions like, how can numbers look like liberation? How can percentages be kind? So many stories can be told in how a country spends its money. There are so many stories of broken hope and unfulfilled dreams, of tragedy and what ifs. Perceived heroes becoming villains, the real ones becoming martyrs, and the hope becoming notes in history. Even the temporary sparks of light were once in a generation miracles, bright, shiny, sometimes solitary things. But this is a time that envisions everyday miracles like grass that grows through concrete, or rain on a summer day, or rivers of hot steam, or honey from bees. The people want the vision to be as mundane as breathing, for the spectacular to be the norm. So they work in solidarity to be one amongst many. GDP is no longer a thing in this place. Here, they measure happiness, wellness, leisure, love, safety, shelter, education, freedom, beauty. They measure the health of the people, the soil, the waters, and the air. They measure life. All of these are signs of wealth, indicators of an economy of abundance for all the people. Here, all the gains are shared and all the people are cared for. Here, it is clear that there is enough for the living to live, and in this place, the harvest must always be mutual.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. Crystal, thank you so much. You have to share that. Everyone has to share their wisdom. That's amazing. Thank you very much. Nancy, you're going to also tell us how you got to the work that you're doing before you commence with your presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. How I got here, following the wrong people, bad company. Morning, everyone. Nancy again, South Feminist Futures. Have worked with the NGOs and development for a long time. And sort of got to this stage where I think this whole question of having done advocacy in various spaces, seeing what it delivers and the limitations, and needing to have spaces for ourselves to really spend time thinking. I am a bit of a policy person. So the questions of formulating policy and who decides what's going to be on the agenda, not just in terms of economics and economic justice, but also in terms of women's rights. So you ask yourself, okay, today we're doing child marriage. Yes, it's very important, but why? Where did this come from? Who decided that this is going to be the agenda there? So a lot of what, also a sense that connecting across borders, not just because I want to fly, but and get air points, but because connecting across borders, connecting across languages, I think has always been the richness of Pan-African feminism and the richness of South feminism across the global South. So I think, being a person who was born at the time of decolonization. I'm always inspired by the different movements and connections that were made for those moments to be possible, in spite of the fact that not everything happened the way it was, but carrying that spirit in those worlds. So yeah, I hope that's enough. I just wanted to say thank you so much, Charmaine, for a very comprehensive, expansive, taking us back, taking us forward, really breaking it all down this morning, locating our situation very clearly in the questions of extractivism, which has always been the challenge of Africa's encounter with the outside, well, not always, but over the last 500 years or so, has always been a place of extraction, and the rationale of much of what we're going through being driven by that desire to extract from Africa. And so many of the questions and injustices around gender coming from that. The question of the global economy and gender justice. And I was thinking about this from the perspective of geopolitics. Geopolitical economy. It's always that when you're talking about gender justice, it's one silo, and when you're talking about geopolitics, it's another silo. And so, Russia invading Ukraine and multipolarity and new powers, and suddenly questions of gender get, they're no longer important to business. Then it becomes like, wow, guys with guns, there. This is now big. Cultural issue, it's a micro issue, it's not a macro issue. So when we're doing macroeconomics and talk about genders, it's GDP. We're talking about international relations and we want to bring in women's rights. It's not an international diplomatic issue. So I think trying to figure out how do we, looking forward, how do we articulate the connections more clearly and integrate those connections into our activism, so that we both when we are in our own spaces, international political economy is centered around questions of gender justice, and when we are in the international spaces, gender justice is being centered within those spaces. And I think there's some bridges that we need to there's some connections that we need to articulate and in our own analysis, so that we can feminism, feminist activism located itself squarely in the realm of global anti-colonial, anti-imperialist. women's issues, go ahead and do it. We've got our support. We're carrying on with the big business of running the world, which they didn't do very well anyways, but you know, this was the way the split came about. And yet, if we really think about it, if we really think about it, gender is integral to geopolitics. So if geopolitics is based on ideas of the nation state, masculinity is what defines the state. Our states want to describe themselves as masculine. The so that's how it's framed. So and then, but when we want to talk about the nation state and its legitimacy, this is based on what women do. So if women are immoral, then that's the, you know, women's purity is the purity of the nation, right? So we are policed, but we're not just policed for moral reasons. We are policed because the nation state is building its legitimacy on the basis of certain types of gender relations and a certain type of patriarchal social contract that then says, well, you know, we might not all be men of the same class, but we all share this patriarchal social contract, and that's the collusion, and then women are there sort of like feeding into that. So gender is fundamental and central to geopolitics, to the way nations are conducting their relations. So these questions of so the question of how do we reinsert feminist politics into geopolitics and geopolitics into feminist struggles, I think is one where we really need to think our agendas, our issues, our ways of working, our practice, and our politics and positioning those questions, because all the points that Charmaine raised this morning requires us to change and to rethink how we approach these questions. The national one, it's also international and global. So even nations that claim to be in competition with each other, when we look at how international relations and global affairs are run, despite the fact that there are more women in positions of leadership, it is this global, international, cis-heteropatriarchal social contract, the brotherhood of the traveling pants. So our own states are just already, maybe from the get-go, are complicit with keeping colonialism alive through keeping colonial gender regimes alive, kicking and emphasizing the legitimacy of a nation state on sets of gender relations that have nothing to do with history or tradition or pre-colonial times, that are completely colonial in the way they function, being gender binaries, etc., etc. So this is the way the system works. And so the state, not our friend, we know it, I mean, it's what we've got, but we need to interrogate that and the way gender has played a role in keeping colonialism intact. And the same gender regimes are happening in these points around South-South cooperation that we were talking about with BRICS and so on and so forth. The pretense of challenging anti-imperialism, okay, maybe it's not completely pretense, but the basis for challenge to say, you know, we're against neo-colonialism, we are against anti-imperialism, on self-determination for our countries and choose our own development path. But these are still very much built around the old masculinities of liberation struggles. Yes, there's more prominence of women leaders, not that women leaders were not there before, but the fundamental basis for these relationships is this sort of masculine type of thing. And even worse now, I think what you start seeing is that rather than necessarily ideas of unification, they're being built on states which increasingly are adopting its homophobic, transphobic, ethno-nationalist, religious, and that being the basis of the new type of nation building, rather than a far more emancipatory vision that would have been there before, and it's becoming so foundational and so dangerous. And even in the competition with the West, what you're having is the South, parts of the South that are saying, well, we espouse traditional values, the West is decadent, look, they have gay rights, they have this. So these kinds of discourses are the ones that are coming in to the detriment of really building anything transformative, but they're central to the geopolitics and the way it's being constructed. So whether you're on one side or the other side, it's not going to come out with anything that necessarily benefits women, except in that very classical way of how they want to construct gender for the sake of the nation. And of course, as pointed out, it's based on extractivism, so we haven't got that out the window, based on militarism. They are not anti-colonial and transformative, and they still pay absolutely no attention to questions of social reproduction and women's labor at all. We don't see it anywhere in any of the agreements. And like, if someone can bring me one of those ones that we were talking about that says, women's, the reproduction of households, etc., is key to our development, I haven't seen it, which you would have seen before, educated woman, educated village, however bad those points were, but at least it made a difference, You don't see that happening anymore. The other point is around how much time? Around the question of multilateralism. So the multilateral setting, when I say multilateralism, it's the UN, I guess mainly, that's our terrain of action. But we have the Bretton Woods institutions. So we have this spaces on the one hand, which have really allowed us to sort of set these global gender norms, come together, and it's been a focus for both Pan-African and transnational organizing. But the limitations, we have to confront the limitations of the multilateral system as it is now, the way it is being weakened, attacked, undermined to achieve any form of progressive changes so far. Right now, I think we're at the stage where if they say have an international agreement, just say no. No, it is just opening the door to further neocolonialism, sort of corporate capture rules that are coming through. So it's colonialism through these international treaties, whereas before we kind of had these human rights conventions and economic and social rights conventions that we thought were a kind of bulwark against the viciousness of global imperialist capital. So we are having corporate powers that have learned to use the multilateral system, and then we have to ask ourselves whether this is what this is going to deliver. And I am a multilateralist to the core, but it's very despondent to see whether this can happen. We also have these kind of ideas of like, oh, let's have feminist foreign policy. I mean, which really become this sort of like pink washing, but they also have a way of like then dividing us because we want a feminist foreign policy. But what does it mean in a world where structurally everything that comes to just, put the what do they call it? Lipstick? The pink washing side of it, yeah. It's a particularly problematic form of, I think that it's been driven. It's this imperial, civilizational form of
feminism that is also Islamophobic, that is, so, and it's racist, and it's like, oh yes, we're helping women in Afghanistan, but you don't say anything about sanctions. So we have this, again, issue of apartheid, so it drives us into there to say, oh, foreign policy means that we must all, stand in solidarity with women in Afghanistan when, the entire central bank's reserves have been seized and taken away, and they can't fund hospitals. So again, some, even, and our own action within these spaces, how sometimes just because I know, when our funders say they want to see gains, we must also be honest to say, we didn't achieve it. And there's a lot of this like, yeah, we've got donors, we must show that we've done something. So climate COP is a case in point. We have not gained anything in COP, and we're going 20 years of those negotiations. It's always going backwards, always going backwards. But we say, yeah, we've got loss and damage for the first time. Principle, and we celebrate that as a great victory. And there's no money anyway. They're like, now we're going to work to get the finance. You're not going to get finance. It's not happening. So just sort of critiquing some of what we do, all of us together, and this claiming no easy victories, tell no lies. That was the, we must not stop claiming easy victories. So just to finish up, we have to, I think the question of the global geopolitics that, as Charmaine emphasized this morning, is around questions of extractivism. It's around the means of production, land, labor, technology, knowledge, finance, and these are really key to how the way the architectures of the distribution of these basic resources that we need for life, that we need for sustenance, that we need to thrive, that we need for self-determination. It still remains fundamental to what is going to happen. And I think particularly from our side, look at questions of labor and social reproduction. I mean, if you want feminist foreign policy, go to the Cuban doctors who've been celebrating 60 years of sending out these medical brigades, and going out and supporting more of, as we're building, and encouraging and even telling states that that's the kind of thing we need to be seeing. It's not just about like standing at a conference in suits with the Queen, sorry, the King. I digress. So yes, so there's a edition of Feminist Africa on Pan-Africanism. Feminist movements are political movements. To me, Pan-African feminism is a political movement. It's not just a social movement, it's a political movement. It's an intellectual movement. It's an activist on the ground movement. And I think we have to rebuild our Pan-Africanism as a liberation movement, as a political movement, and think of this as the challenge of what we need to do in the future so that we can actually respond to the challenges that are being posed. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you very much for that. I have no words. You've heard it. Okay. Without wasting time, Leah, can you please give us the preamble and then start?
Yes. But as I do that, hi everyone.
Wi-Fi is, as you have seen, is a
My
problem.
name is Leah.
Just a minute. The new Feminist Africa Conference number 2. You can introduce yourself as we wait.
Oh, all right. Okay. Hi, my name is Leah. I'm also just getting my water. Like I said earlier, I'm a student at the London School of Economics. I'm doing a master's in social and economic inequalities, which is a program that straddles analysis both in the social and economic sphere. And I guess the constant contradiction and creation of a dichotomy between the social and the economic, and this being an agenda particularly pushed by economists, orthodox economists, and maybe classical economics, to construct economics as disembedded from society. So your human rights do not matter, your happiness does not matter, it's just the invisible hand of supply and demand, and trying to construct economics as mathematical, as a pure science, because the thinking is that prevents it from biases. But we also know that even with the natural sciences, the questions that you ask and the formulas that you develop still determine the responses that you get. So there is no human knowledge that is free of human bias. So that is kind of where I started, but also I think driven by a frustration of doing a lot of social policy issues and having no traction, and realizing that there was a structural analysis that was not inclusive of the material conditions necessary to bring about the social changes that needed to happen. So today I'm going to be, let me just set up my timer really quickly. I'm going to be talking about something that you've probably had talked about quite a bit, but I'm hoping that I can introduce a different dimension to the conversation. It is also likely that when you were coming to Uganda or on your many journeys across the continent, you've probably come across people dressed like the image that I have on my screen. I'm sorry, I have okay, there we go. So today I want to talk about the transnational labor migration of women as domestic workers. While I'm going to focus on Uganda as my case study, because that's the context that I know best in relation to this particular issue, the analysis can be transposed onto any context, because this is now a global issue that is affecting African women. If you go to Kenya, if you go to Ethiopia, Nigeria, lots of women being exported, and that word is very important, as domestic workers. But also beyond the continent, if you're looking at the Philippines, you're looking at Sri Lanka, and just a number of Southeast Asian countries, this has become a new site of struggle. So I want to start off my presentation by sharing this slide of Uganda's top commodity exports. This is from 2020-21. This is an analysis done by the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development using data from Bank of Uganda. So I won't go through all of them, but as is the case in many African countries, it's primary commodities. So the very first, the biggest foreign exchange earner in Uganda is mineral products. And I was thinking that it was very conveniently named mineral products, because if you unpack that, the top mineral product is gold. And gold is not a natural resource that is produced in a large enough quantity to earn the kind of foreign exchange that it earns. So Uganda is also implicated in illicit financial flows of proceeds from natural resources. So a lot of this gold is coming from the Congo, and then there's a gold refinery in Uganda. This is conflict gold, so the money then leaves Uganda, the gold leaves Uganda rather more legitimately, without asking questions about points of origin. The second product is coffee. which has been one of the biggest foreign exchange earners for Uganda since the colonial period. And so on and on it goes. I would like to make a provocation and say that there is a very important commodity. My argument actually is that women are the second biggest commodity export out of Uganda. And I'm going to be very deliberate in why I'm saying it is women themselves as the product, not necessarily the proceeds of their labor, women being exported. And the second argument I'm going to make is that Uganda is moving from being a cash crop economy, which is what it has always been known for, although cash crops as produced by peasants, and is moving to a labor reserve economy. Before I make those, maybe before I analyze those arguments, I just want to provide a brief context of how this labor migration is happening rather. So the Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Development introduced something called the Externalization of Labor Program. And this was basically a way for the government to formalize labor export of women that was already happening, but it was women being trafficked. Someone meets you on the road, you say you want a job, they say, oh, I know someone in Oman, I know someone in Kuwait, this is all you have to do. And because the government obviously had the challenge of very high unemployment rates, and coupled with an opportunity of certain countries actually requiring labor, this then became an opportunity that they could use. And as you can see, the objective is to create a safe, orderly, regular, and formal channel for Ugandans who choose to seek employment abroad to do so. So ever since this program was introduced in 2005, labor export to the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is where most of these people transported are taken, has exploded, and I'm going to share with you the numbers. Most of the jobs, someone talked about Cuban doctors, nobody's looking for doctors, nobody's looking for nurses, nobody's looking to hire, although in a different context, Africans in professional positions are a hot cake, but not in this particular context. In this particular context, most of the jobs available are security guards, cleaners, and domestic workers. Most of the security guard and cleaner jobs are taken up by men, and the majority of jobs on the other end are taken up by women. So the numbers that I'm going to share with you today do not paint the entire picture of the scale of this labor export, because it is only over the last 2 or 3 years that there has been a formalization of tracking who's leaving, and particularly really through the national airport and not through border posts like Malaba or elsewhere, that now we have numbers. So the numbers that I have are for an 8 months period. 8 months is not even the entire year. So the numbers from Entebbe International Airport show that 64,000 people exited to go to work as migrant laborers in the Gulf Cooperation Council. It's not people just going anywhere else. Out of those 64,000, 59,000 were women. I think you can see the scale of that. If we're looking at the remittances, I think the previous year, the remittances of $900 million US. This from the Gulf Cooperation Council. Make no mistake, this is not from Ugandans living in the UK or in other countries, just the Gulf Cooperation Council. $2 billion. At this point in time, the remittances from labor export are far outpacing one of our biggest foreign exchange earners, which made us a cash crop economy. How coffee is doing, $718 million US in 2021. Knowing the context in which we live, you then would know that this becomes a hot cake. It becomes a point of contention. So early this year, I think it was March, must have been March, I think it was one of those Women's Day activities. There is a consortium of independent journalists who developed a documentary on labor export, and they wanted to show it. And the police were deployed to keep them from showing the documentary. Why? Those are really important questions to have. So it is because of the data that I've shown you that I'm making the case that, first of all, Ugandan women are the second, maybe they could even be the top, because honestly, gold is not our product. We could very well make an export out of Uganda. And that all, and because in scale, and rather because of the remittances, and also because I'm choosing to construct women as a commodity. So the reason why I am saying that is, so what, when you do a Marxist analysis, when we talk about something called labor power, it's the work that you do, your mental ability to do something and create value out of it. That is what we call labor power. But you see, the thing is, labor power is embedded in a human being. You can't necessarily separate the two things. So if the women want to sell their labor power, they want to sell their skills by cleaning houses and doing whatever work they're being hired for, that labor cannot be separated from them. So they too sort of have to be sold. So that is where my argument comes in. Some theorization about just that contradiction, that human beings cannot be commodities. They can only be commodities if they are slaves, because there is somebody who owns them. They do not, they cannot make a wage from their labor. But if we look at the current regimes of labor migration and work, it is not too different from slavery. The only difference now is that there is a wage, but it is not necessarily a wage that gives you a decent life. It is a wage that is born or that comes from living a really, really precarious life and doing really, really precarious work. So some thinkers like Sidney Mintz and Carl Polanyi, as rather looking at labor as a false or a fictitious commodity, because ultimately a human being cannot be a commodity, and yet at the same time they are. And so that is what I think about women's. The other argument that I have made is the change of Uganda from a cash crop economy to a labor reserve economy. So when we look at the modes of integration of African states into capitalist colonial economies, they were grouped into something called macro regions by an economist that Charmaine referenced earlier, Samir Amin, who's a Marxist. I think he's Egyptian. He was Egyptian. So these groupings, I'm not going to spend too much time on them because I want to really focus on Africa of the labor reserve, but it was basically just the different ways that African economies were exploited. And depending on the context, where the cost of colonial administration was just too high. And so they basically just chartered this, gave private companies charters to go and exploit however they wanted, particularly in the Congo in the case of rubber. And then Africa of the labor reserve, which was created a wage laborer to go and do work for white capital. So most of the countries that are was for them to go and work in the mines. But you see, the thing is, one of the critical ways in which African economies were transformed is that before that, most people were producing for subsistence. You produce just enough to feed yourself. In order to make me go and work in a mine, you need to make me desperate enough, because why else would I wake up and go and work in a mine or work for hours on a plantation? So it meant that there needed to be certain structural, administrative, financial, and legal ways of creating a wage laborer so that they could go and work in service of white capital. And so the argument I'm making is that there's certain processes of dispossession that have happened in Uganda as well, such that now people have no means of subsistence except, and they've been made so so yeah, this is kind of what I was talking about. So if we are looking at the systems of dispossession that all my colleagues have talked about, we've talked about land grabs, we've talked about structural adjustment. All those are processes that are related to neoliberalism. What it has done is create a pauper class, a class of system. So what you have is a whole generation of people who are being told thing that they can do, even with an education, is go and work as a domestic worker. Or some did not go to school at all. So basically what that system has done is create a whole new class of workers because they have no other choice. So the system within the so if you look at the other reason why I'm making the claim that Uganda has now become a labor reserve, or rather a labor reserve economy, is that you can see based that this is something that is not going to stop in the near future. You can see that there is a deliberate process of further marginalization of people so that there is a constant reserve army of labor. When we look at that concept, obviously we're talking about what I've already described, which is that people are so desperate that they're willing to work at any cost. And capital can use them however they want. You can come and get people and employ them. And then when things get a little too hard, then you're thrown out of work. And women become make the perfect candidates for the reserve army of labor because of the many things that I've talked about before. So if you're looking at where, so what happens is the women are given 2-year contracts. And so what it means is that they go to a country and work for 2 years and then they come back. So you're tired, it means that it's time to get rid of you after 2 years. There are millions more waiting, dying to come. And so you just keep rinsing and repeating. So you can see how it's a continuation. So all that is happening is Uganda is supplying over and over again. But also what this transnational labor migration is showing is what Charmaine talked about earlier, about new global powers, what we're seeing now are new sites of capitalist accumulation. So these women are going to the Gulf Cooperation Council, all of social reproduction, which in most societies is what would be expected of women. That work to somebody else that desperately needs it. But now I have a critical question. Who are these women again? I think this will be my last slide.
The truth is, we cannot do each and everything within 14 days. The truth is, we cannot do each and everything within 14 days. Because most of the people we get are really, like, we get a lot of people who are completely illiterate, who have never gone to school, like, who have never come to town, they don't know even a bulb, about, they've never seen electricity, they've never seen any form of civilization. But what we do, at least we introduce you to this modern, understand each and everything in 14 days, but at least we give her an idea of where she's going. At least she's not as empty as she was before coming to the training.
Okay, I'm going to contextualize this video. So this person that's speaking is somebody that works for a labor recruitment company. So what the government has done is they have introduced something called labor export and recruitment regulations. So as one of the processes of legitimizing this labor export, in 2 minutes. Because of stories of torture, of withholding of wages, of so many other things that you've probably heard of, as happens in very many situations, people, there's a quickness to think, oh, we just need a policy. We just need a policy that is going to hold people accountable, and then everything will be all right. So that is what the government has done. And one of the things they've mandated, and this is actually, it's not even a policy, it is just a licensing regime. It's just regulations. So one of the provisions within the regulations is that all domestic workers that are being exported have to go through a pre-departure orientation of 2 weeks. So what this person was expressing was their frustration in educating these poor, empty, uncivilized, never been to school women. But she talks, her analysis basically reveals the kind of women that are participating in this labor export. Some of them are from rural areas. They've actually never had any experience traveling. Most of these domestic workers, the very first time they are on a plane is when they're going. So it gives you a picture also of just how precarious this work becomes, because you're literally being uprooted. Even within your own context of home, you're not necessarily somebody who has had access to certain things, and you're being uprooted and taken somewhere else where the culture is different. You're in a kitchen, they're telling you use a microwave. So what the government was saying, oh, they're mistreating them because they don't know how to do the housework. But you see, the thing is, that's not the reason. What is undergirding this exploitation and mistreatment is two things. It's issues of race, it's issues of gender, it is issues of class. The class issue, because you can see how condescendingly this woman talks about these women. These are women who are easy to miss. I remember the state minister for foreign affairs said, I would never send my child. That is, if you get time, you can check out the entire document. Tell them not to go. If you have a choice, outgoing because they are desperate, because you have created situations where they cannot make a living. But also what you're doing is you're legitimating the process. So what we're hearing from the government now is, as long as you go with a registered labor company, rather a registered recruitment company, it will be safe. That is not true. Because the nature of migrant work and within the GCC, there is even no path to settlement, so then you have no access to citizenship rights. So what you constantly have is permanent outsider status. So I read somewhere, I'm sorry, I won't be able to quote who said this exactly, but they were basically saying that I desire the labor that you're going to perform, but I do not desire you because you're a black woman. So I just need you to come and do the thing and leave. And I'll cut a fresh face. And so it continues. So this has, of course, significant implications. I've already talked about that legitimation of exploitation of women who are poor and therefore invisible in terms of the people that we empathize with. But also it's implicating the state in these processes of racial capitalism. Because what you now hear, remember the first objective that I talked about when they developed the labor export program, they said this is a temporary happy. They said, oh, we were very strong this time in our negotiations, the women are going to be treated better. In fact, things are going so well that now we are looking at markets like Canada, Finland. So you see, it's not stopping. Why? So you see how women are now being constructed and repurposed to be the thing on which our country's economy is going to be built. Not with decent work, into that idea. So I'm going to stop here because there's going to be lots of room for discussion. Thank you so much.
Totally depressed me. The four presentations this morning and afternoon have painted a fantastic backdrop on which that we'll have all the other discussions, they're all interrelated. But I really, really want to thank the four presenters, beginning with you, Charmaine, Crystal, Nancy, and Belle, for doing a fantastic job. I can already see 2 or 3 volumes of Feminist Africa. Fantastic. Very, very, but this is what we're going through. And people need to know because, these things are painted, they're pink washed and all that, but, thank you. So what I want us to do is, we have 10 minutes to lunch, but after lunch, we'll have 3 groups. will, but we have to have some plenary to just, hey, express. Yeah, okay? So I have a few announcements. Again, I talked about pictures. They want to put some conference pictures online. So if you have any objection, just see Patience or Afi, and they will make sure that they honor your wish. Was it Jibu who had the announcement? Yes, I want you to make your announcement now. And the other thing is that we have lunch coupons for you. Those ones who Feminist Africa is financing. There are several self-financing participants as well. But the coupons are for the Feminist Africa.
Thank you. Again, this is not about spinning. So I'm the treasurer of an African association called the African Association of Africa, African Studies Association of Africa. And we were founded in 2013, and we're 10 years old, and we are a group of African studies scholars and Africanists and Friends of Africa that are interested in thinking about researching and discussing the future of Africa. And so our 10th anniversary is this year, and our 5th biannual conference is also this year. We had one conference in University of Ibadan. That was in, I can't give you the years. We had one conference, that was in 2015. We had one conference at the University of Ghana, Institute of African Studies, 2017. We went to Nairobi in 2019, and last year in 2022, we went to Cape Town, University of Cape Town. And so this year, in 2023, we are breaking the linguistic divide and going into Francophone Africa. We will have our first ever conference in Lubumbashi, DRC, October 25th through the 28th. So our title, our theme is Repatriating Africa, Old Challenges and New Insights. And our call for papers and panels is out. Unfortunately, the deadline is May 31st, but we're extending it for 1 week for Feminist Africa. So if you are interested in attending or even presenting a panel, I'm gonna ask Jifa to we'll send a link. But we really think that we need Feminist Africa's voice at ASA 2023, particularly this very vital conversation. So if anyone has any questions, and you can also become a member of ASAA, and you can also be institutional members as well. Thank you very much. So any questions, you can come to me.
Thank you very much, Jibu. Those of us who studied in the US, there's that Association of African Studies, their annual conferences. And so they decided to bring it here. We don't want to be, it's researched and talked about by white Africanists, so-called Africanists. So it is a very, very good cause. And I would encourage many of you to speak to her. Okay, I think let's not begin our discussion now. I think we should go for lunch, and I'll come back and we have a very good conversation. Thank you all for your attention. And again, thank you. All right. I have to tell the online participants that we will not be able to stream the group discussions in the afternoon. So you'll be with us in the mornings, unfortunately. But thank you very much. You can share your questions and comments in the comments sections, and we'll consider them. And then tomorrow morning in the recap, we'll be able to address them. Thank you very much. We acknowledge you and thank you very much for being in the room virtually. Sorry. Oh, yes, I'm telling our virtual participants, thank you very much. We acknowledge you and we hope to see you again tomorrow. If you have any comments, leave them in the comment section and during the recap tomorrow morning, we'll address them. Thank you very much. Okay, so Feminist African Femme